Imagine you're lying on a table. A surgeon is standing over you with a blade in his hand. You are completely awake. You can feel everything. Before 1846, that wasn't a nightmare. That was just surgery. Patients would scream so loud the neighbors could hear them from the street. Surgeons used to pride themselves on speed, not skill. The faster you cut, the fewer seconds a person had to suffer. The best surgeons in the world would amputate a leg in under 90 seconds, not because they were precise, because they were racing against a person's ability to stay conscious from pure agony. And then, one man changed everything. He discovered that you could put a human being into a painless sleep, that surgery didn't have to be torture, that medicine could finally be merciful. His name was Horace Wells, and you've probably never heard of it. Here's why that's one of the most heartbreaking stories in the entire history of science. To understand what Horace Wells actually did, you need to feel what the world was like before him. We're talking about the early 1840s. Medicine was advancing fast. Stethoscopes had just been invented. Germ theory was beginning to take shape. But surgery? Surgery was still essentially a medieval act performed in a modern coat. There was no anesthesia, no painkillers strong enough to matter. Surgeons would sometimes give patients alcohol, not as medicine, just to dull the psychological edge of knowing what was about to happen. Patients would beg. Some would fight back and have to be physically restrained by multiple assistants. Some would faint, and surgeons would consider that lucky. Some would die, not from the operation itself, but from shock, pure physiological shock caused by unbearable pain. Here's a detail that puts this in perspective. In 1811, the author Fanny Burney underwent a mastectomy while fully conscious. She survived and later wrote a letter describing the experience in devastating detail. She wrote about the moment the surgeon's knife entered her chest. "I began a scream that lasted unintermittently during the whole time of the incision." The whole time, uninterrupted. That was normal. That was just what surgery was. So when someone came along and said, "I think I found a way to stop this," that wasn't just a medical breakthrough. That was potentially the most humane invention in the history of human suffering. And the man who found it first was a quiet dentist from Connecticut who went to a laughing-gas show in a winter night in 1844. Horace Wells was 30 years old, successful, and deeply bothered by something most dentists just accepted, that pulling teeth caused people extraordinary pain, and nobody seemed to be actively trying to fix that. In December 1844, a traveling entertainer named Gardner Colton came to Hartford, Connecticut with a popular stage show. The act was simple and wildly entertaining for the era. Audience members would inhale nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and stumble around the stage making fools of themselves while the crowd roared. Horace Wells was in the audience that night. But he wasn't watching the laughter. He was watching something else. One of the volunteers, a man named Samuel Cooley, inhaled the gas, started stumbling around, and slammed his shin hard into a wooden bench, hard enough to draw blood, hard enough that it should have hurt badly. Cooley kept laughing. He didn't even flinch. Wells leaned forward in his seat. He didn't feel that? The next morning, and this is the part that tells you everything about who Horace Wells was, he didn't write a paper. He didn't form a committee. He didn't wait for permission. He sat down in his own dentist's chair, had Gardner Colton administer the gas directly to him, and had a colleague pull one of his own teeth. He woke up and said, "It is the greatest discovery ever made. I didn't feel it so much as the prick of a pin." Within weeks, he was using nitrous oxide on his patients. It worked. People sat through teeth extractions without screaming, without gripping the armrests until their knuckles went white, without crying. They simply didn't feel it. He had done it. He had found the answer to a question that had haunted medicine for centuries. Now, all he had to do was show the world. That's where everything fell apart. In January 1845, Horace Wells arranged to demonstrate his discovery at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in America. This was his moment. The room was full of students from Harvard Medical School. He administered nitrous oxide to a patient who needed a tooth extracted. And then something went wrong. The exact details are still debated by historians.
Either Wells misjudged the dosage, or the patient had an unusually low threshold, or the gas was administered too briefly. But the patient cried out during the procedure. The room erupted. Students hissed. Faculty members shook their heads. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Humbug!" That single word, humbug, echoed through the medical establishment. It meant fraud, trickery, a waste of everyone's time. Wells left Boston humiliated. Here's what makes this moment so brutal. The patient later said he hadn't actually felt significant pain. The cry might have been a reflex, an involuntary sound, not a scream of agony. But it didn't matter. The narrative had already been written. Horace Wells was a failure. His discovery was a joke. He went back to Hartford, quietly devastated. And while he retreated, someone else moved forward. William Morton had been a student and former business partner of Horace Wells. He knew about the nitrous oxide experiments. He'd watched Wells work, and after the Boston disaster, Morton didn't abandon the concept of anesthesia. He quietly pursued it himself, using a different compound, ether. In October 1846, less than 2 years after Wells's humiliating demonstration, Morton performed a successful public demonstration of ether anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital. The same room, a different outcome. The patient remained completely unconscious and pain-free throughout the procedure. The surgeon performing the operation, Dr. John Collins Warren, turned to the audience and said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." A direct reference to what had been said about Wells. The world celebrated Morton. Newspapers called it a miracle. Ether anesthesia spread across Europe and America within months. Morton became famous. He fought for patents, argued for recognition, appeared before Congress demanding financial reward. Horace Wells watched all of this from Connecticut. He had written letters, filed claims, tried to assert that he had been first, that Morton had built on his work, that the principle was the same even if the compound was different. The medical community largely ignored him. The priority dispute consumed him. He began to unravel. By 1848, Horace Wells was barely recognizable as the optimistic, curious dentist who had once sat in a laughing-gas show and seen the future of medicine. He had stopped practicing. He was experimenting on himself, inhaling chloroform, another anesthetic compound, in increasing doses. Historians who have studied this period describe the pattern as self-medication, possibly an attempt to escape the psychological weight of what had happened to him. On January 21, 1848, Wells was arrested in New York City for throwing sulfuric acid at pedestrians in a dissociated state, almost certainly under the influence of chloroform. He was thrown into the Tombs, Manhattan's notorious jail. 2 days later, he was dead. He had smuggled a razor blade into his cell. Under the influence of chloroform, likely one final self-administered dose, he cut his femoral artery. He left a note saying he was not fully in his right mind and asked for forgiveness. He was 33 years old. Here's the unbearable irony. Just 4 days before his death, the Paris Medical Society had officially voted to credit Horace Wells as the true discoverer of anesthesia. The letter recognizing him was already on its way. He never read it. The story of anesthesia is almost always told with William Morton at the center. Medical textbooks, museum plaques, and historical timelines have for most of recorded history credited the October 1846 ether demonstration as the birth of anesthesia. Morton spent the rest of his life in bitter, expensive legal battles trying to secure a patent and financial reward. He never received it. He died at 59, largely broke. The man who actually first demonstrated surgical anesthesia, Wells, died in a jail cell at 33 just before the world admitted he was right all along. There is a statue of Horace Wells today in Hartford, Connecticut, and in Paris, placed there by the French government in recognition of the 1848 decision. Most people walk past it without knowing his name. The American Dental Association eventually recognized Wells as the discoverer of anesthesia. So did the American Medical Association, but decades after his death. Here's what I keep coming back to. Horace Wells didn't fail because his idea was wrong. He failed because of one bad afternoon in front of the wrong audience at the wrong moment. And that one bad afternoon undid everything. Not just his career, but his sense of self, his mental stability, his entire life. We talk about scientific progress like it's clean and logical, like the best idea always wins, like truth eventually rises to the surface on its own. But the story of Horace Wells tells a very different truth. Sometimes the right idea arrives at the wrong moment. Sometimes the person who sees the future first is the one who gets crushed by it. Sometimes history remembers the person who demonstrated it second, because the second demonstration went better. Every time you sit in a dentist chair and feel nothing, every time someone goes under for surgery and wakes up pain-free, every time a child doesn't have to be held down and screaming, that's Horace Wells, a man who changed the experience of being human and was forgotten before he could know it.